The movie ends, 3 GT40S cross the finish line. Ken Miles gets robbed in broad daylight by a rulebook technicality. Carroll Shelby stands alone on the pit wall, stares into the middle distance, and the credits roll on one of the greatest racing stories ever put on screen. And that's where Hollywood leaves him. Frozen in that moment. A legend. Untouchable. Done. But Carroll Shelby wasn't done. Not even close. He had 50 more years left, and they were going to be stranger, messier, and more extraordinary than anything James Mangold put in that film. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle. Ford fires its own hero. Here's something Ford versus Ferrari never tells you, because it can't. The film ends in 1966. The firing happens later. And it's uglier than you'd expect from a company that had just won Le Mans. By 1967, Carroll Shelby was running the most successful racing operation in America. His GT40S had dominated Le Mans. His Shelby Mustangs were selling in enormous numbers. He had more momentum than almost any car builder in the country. And Ford, with the clinical efficiency of a corporation that had gotten exactly what it needed from a partnership, quietly decided it no longer needed the partnership. In 1970, Ford ended the racing agreement with Shelby entirely. The Shelby Mustang program was shut down. Ford had decided they could build performance Mustangs in-house without cutting Shelby a check for the privilege. The GT40 program was finished. The Cobra was already gone. By 1971, the 3 subsidiaries that Shelby American had split into, the Shelby Automotive Company, the Shelby Racing Company, and the Shelby Parts Company, had all ceased operations. The man who beat Ferrari at Le Mans was out of a job. But underneath the business collapse was something worse. A betrayal so simple, it almost seems like a joke. Back in 1965, at the height of their partnership, Shelby had signed over the Cobra name to Ford. The price, $1. One. Henry Ford II personally told him he could use the name whenever he wanted for the rest of his life. And Shelby, who trusted the people he worked with the way most men trust their own family, believed him. It was only decades later, when Shelby tried to rebuild his brand around the Cobra name, that he discovered what that handshake was actually worth. Ford owned the name. Shelby's attorney eventually found the contract. Ford's position was simple. The name belonged to Ford because Shelby had sold it to the company for $1. The man who invented the Cobra didn't own the rights to his own creation. Let that sit for a second. The man who beat Ferrari moved to Africa. After Ford cut him loose, Carroll Shelby did something that no Hollywood screenwriter would ever put in a script, because no Hollywood screenwriter would ever believe it. He moved to Africa. For most of the 1970s, Shelby lived in Botswana, Angola, and the Central African Republic, where he ran a safari company and traded in diamonds. I want to be very clear about what that sentence means. The man who built the Cobra, who developed the GT40, who turned the Mustang into a race winner, spent an entire decade tracking game across Central Africa, eating around campfires, and living as far from Detroit as it is physically possible to get without leaving the planet. Think about the timing of this. The 1970s was the decade American performance cars collapsed. The oil crisis hit. Emissions regulations strangled horsepower. The muscle car era didn't fade, it fell off a cliff. And Shelby, who had more or less built the American performance car as a commercial proposition, looked at what was happening, declared it dead, and left the continent. Honestly, smart call. There's something almost mythological about it. The gunslinger who cleaned up the town walked to the edge of the map and kept walking. Shelby wasn't sulking, he wasn't hiding. He was a man who needed wide-open spaces, and when American motorsport stopped offering them, he found them somewhere else. He also, during this period, lived on a ranch in Texas where he raised miniature horses and African cattle. The man had range, literal and figurative range. He accidentally co-founded Chili's. Here is my favorite fact about Carroll Shelby. Are you ready? This one is going to live in your head forever. In 1967, the same year his GT40S were dominating Le Mans for the second consecutive time, Shelby co-founded the World Championship Chili Cook-Off in Terlingua, Texas. He and a friend had bought a piece of land that included an actual ghost town. They decided the best thing to do with a ghost town in the Texas desert was to hold a chili competition in it. Obviously. The event grew. Shelby established the International Chili Society in 1970. He developed Carroll Shelby's original Texas brand chili mix, which he sold to Kraft Inc. Barms in 1986, for what people described with deliberate vagueness as a tidy sum. And then, in 1975, his son-in-law, Larry Levine, came to him looking for seed money to open a chili-themed restaurant in Dallas, Texas. Shelby said yes. That restaurant was the very first Chili's bar and grill. There are currently over 1,200 Chili's locations worldwide. The man who beat Ferrari at Le Mans accidentally co-founded one of the most successful casual dining chains in American history. Not one of those locations has a GT40 on the wall, which feels like a genuine missed opportunity for the brand, but here we are. Carroll Shelby, Le Mans winner, Cobra builder, chili entrepreneur. The man contained multitudes. Spicy, Texas-flavored multitudes. Coca-Cola again. By 1982, the oil crisis had receded. American cars were slowly remembering what they were supposed to be, and a familiar voice came through the phone. Lee Iacocca, the man who had first backed Shelby at Ford back in 1962, who had been fired by Henry Ford II in 1978, with a kind of humiliation usually reserved for public executions, and who had then turned around and dragged Chrysler Corporation back from the edge of bankruptcy, called his old partner and offered him a job. Shelby joined Chrysler as a performance consultant for Dodge. The brief was not glamorous. Take Dodge's lineup of front-wheel drive economy cars, the kind of cars people bought because they had no other options, and make people actually want them. Shelby's response was to turbocharge everything. The Dodge Shelby Charger. The Dodge Omni GLH, which Shelby told anyone who asked, stood for Goes Like Hell. And the Dodge Omni GLHS, Goes Like Hell S'more. These were small, cheap front-wheel drive econoboxes with ridiculous power crammed into them, and they were, against all reasonable expectation, absolutely wonderful. But then came the project that actually mattered. Chrysler's product chief Bob Lutz had been driving a Cobra replica and wanted to build something like it. A raw, brutal American sports car, big V10 engine, no roof, no apologies. Shelby jumped at it. The result was the Dodge Viper. Shelby was on stage with Iacocca and Lutz at the 1989 Detroit Auto Show when the concept was unveiled to the world. The crowd went sideways. America remembered what it had been missing. But here's where it gets complicated. Shelby's heart failed him at the moment of his greatest second act. He received a heart transplant on June 7, 1990, and missed the key stages of the Viper's development while recovering from surgery. He was honest about it in the way he was honest about everything. I built the first Viper, he said, but the project moved back to Chrysler when I had to have a heart transplant. So I didn't really have much to do with the finished version, even though most people think I do. Less than a year after his transplant, Shelby drove a Dodge Viper as the pace car at the 1991 Indianapolis 500. Because of course he did. The heart that kept stopping. This is the part of Carroll Shelby's story that Ford versus Ferrari couldn't tell you, and it might be the most remarkable part of all. Shelby had been living with a ticking clock in his chest since childhood. He was diagnosed with a heart murmur as a boy and spent years forbidden from strenuous activity. He won Le Mans in 1959, racing with nitroglycerin pills under his tongue, placing them there himself before each stint to manage the angina that had been getting worse for years. His heart condition forced him out of racing in 1960. He was 37 years old, at the absolute peak of his abilities as a driver, and his own body took the wheel away from him, so he built cars instead, and spent the next 30 years doing everything a man with a damaged heart supposedly shouldn't do. By 1990, the doctors couldn't hold it together anymore. On June 7th of that year, Shelby received a new heart from a 34-year-old man who had died of an aneurysm. He became one of the oldest heart transplant recipients in American history at the time, and would eventually become one of the nation's longest-living survivors of the procedure. 6 years later, in 1996, his health failed again. This time, the kidney came from his son, Michael. Think about what that actually means. Michael Shelby looked at his father and decided his life was worth the surgery, the risk, the recovery. And Carroll Shelby, a man who had spent his entire life taking enormous risks with machines, accepted a gift that no horsepower figure and no lap time could ever come close to measuring. He summed up his medical situation with characteristic Texas bluntness. "I just wanted to see if I could do it one more time after a heart transplant and a kidney transplant." He did it many more times. The name he didn't own. While all of this was happening, Shelby was also fighting one of the strangest legal battles in automotive history. And it started with the single most expensive dollar ever spent in the history of American motorsport. Back in 1965, at the absolute peak of his partnership with Ford, Shelby had signed over the Cobra name, the car he invented. The car that proved American engineering could embarrass European thoroughbreds on a racetrack. He signed it over for $1 and a handshake from Henry Ford II, who told him he could use the name whenever he wanted for the rest of his life. Shelby believed him. That was his first mistake. For 20 years, the arrangement worked fine because nobody thought too hard about it. But in the late 1980s, when Shelby started building continuation, Cobras, and licensing his name again, Ford suddenly remembered it owned something valuable. Shelby's attorney dug up the contract. $1, black and white. No ambiguity. Ford's position was straightforward and brutal. The name belonged to them, full stop. What followed consumed the better part of a decade. Shelby fought Ford directly, then partnered with Ford against replica makers flooding the market with counterfeit Cobras, then sued those replica makers independently, then fought an entirely separate legal battle over the Eleanor Mustang from Gone in 60 Seconds, a film that had used his car's identity without his blessing and turned it into a licensing nightmare he never asked for. The man who once just wanted to build fast cars spent a significant portion of his later life in courtrooms, arguing about who owned what. Not exactly the second act anyone imagined for the winner of Le Mans. By 1994, his attorney managed to reach an agreement. Shelby received the license to use the Cobra name on all the original 1960s-era cars. Not ownership, a license, permission to use something he had created, granted back to him by the company he had made famous. Ford kept the trademark. Shelby got permission. Think about that carefully. The man who built the Cobra, developed the GT40, and handed Ford one of the greatest marketing victories in automotive history, spent 30 years in legal battles just to earn the right to put his own name on his own car. The riverboat gambler who trusted a handshake finally learned what the handshake was worth. The guilt. He never shook. For all of Shelby's remarkable reinventions, there was one thing he carried through every single chapter of his life after 1966. One conversation he replayed, one decision he could never take back. He said it plainly more than once in interviews across the decades. In 1966, Ford didn't cost Ken Miles the race at Le Mans. I did, and I regret it to this day. Leo Beebe came up to me and said, "Who do you think should win the race?" I said, "What do you think ought to happen, Leo?" He said, "I'd kind of like to see all three of them cross the finish line together." So I said, "Let's do it that way then," not knowing that the French would interpret the rules the way that they did. There's the real villain of this story, not Leo Beebe, not Henry Ford II. A single casual conversation between two men who both thought they were doing the right thing, and the greatest driver Carroll Shelby ever knew paid the price for it. 2 months after Le Mans, Ken Miles was dead. Killed testing the JC car at Riverside Raceway in California, thrown from the vehicle at over 200 miles per hour when rear-end aerodynamic lift caused it to flip. His son Peter, 15 years old, was at the track that day. He watched his father die. After Miles's death, Shelby American never returned to Le Mans endurance racing. Not in 1967, not ever. The team that had beaten Ferrari on Ferrari's own ground on Ferrari's own race simply walked away from it. Shelby said, "Losing Ken broke his heart, and given everything that subsequently happened to that heart, That's not a metaphor you can take lightly. 46 years. From Le Mans 1966 to his death in 2012. Every achievement in that span happened in the shadow of that single pit lane decision. He never publicly forgave himself for it. He never stopped talking about it. Some debts can't be repaid, and Carroll Shelby knew it. The reconciliation and the final lapse. Here is the thing about Carroll Shelby that resists easy summary. After everything, the firing, the name dispute, the 30 years of adversarial legal maneuvering, he came back to Ford. In 2003, Shelby once again partnered with the company that had ended his program, taken his name, and handed him a license to his own creation in place of actual ownership. The second partnership lasted until his death. He appeared at the 2009 North American International Auto Show to help Ford introduce the 540 horsepower Shelby Mustang GT 500. He tested it himself, called it a truly special car that was a great deal of fun to drive. Well into his 80s with someone else's heart and his own son's kidney keeping him alive, he was doing 200-mile-per-hour laps on a test track. Let that image land. The reconciliation wasn't surrender. Shelby never soft-pedaled what had been taken from him. He never pretended the handshake had been honored. He simply decided at some point that what they had built together was worth more than the bitterness of how it ended. I got to do most all the things I wanted to, he said in his final years. I got to travel the world racing sport cars in the 50s, won Le Mans in 1959 while still a young man, developed an American-powered sport car for the masses, beat Ferrari at their own game and on their own turf at the 24 hours, turned the docile little Mustang into a race winner, and then got to see and experience all of Africa before it was ruined. That's not a bitter man talking. That's a man who genuinely believed he'd won. Carroll Shelby died on May 10, 2012, at Baylor Hospital in Dallas. He was 89 years old. He had survived a diseased heart for 8 decades, a heart transplant, a kidney transplant from his own son, multiple collapsed businesses, 30 years of lawsuits, the death of the closest friend he ever had in motorsport, a decade in African bush country, and a period of his life in which his most commercially significant achievement was accidentally funding a chain of casual dining restaurants. He was married 7 times. He raised miniature horses and African cattle on a Texas ranch. He designed approximately 165 different car models. He received Sports Illustrated's Driver of the Year award twice, was inducted into 3 separate halls of fame, and his longtime friend, Dick Messer from the Peterson Automotive Museum, said something about him that cuts straight to the truth. His legacy is the diversity of his life. His life has always been the reinvention of Carroll Shelby. Ford versus Ferrari gave you the moment Carroll Shelby became a legend. The Le Mans victory, the GT40, the pit wall, Matt Damon in a Stetson making it all look effortless. What it couldn't give you was the 50 years of reinvention that followed, the African years, the court battles, the borrowed organs, the children's foundation he quietly built to cover medical bills for kids with the same heart condition that had followed him since boyhood, the unshakable guilt about the one thing he could never take back. Ken Miles died, Carroll Shelby lived, and he spent every year of his remaining life, through every reinvention and every comeback, trying to be worthy of that. That's not a Hollywood ending. It's something harder and more honest than that. And it's the story the credits never showed you.